Y'all, welcome back to Kentucky Fried Wargaming, where two guys who aren't qualified to talk about anything decide to talk about a game with hard math and chance. I'm Joe.
And I'm John.
And on this episode, we continue with the Conquest lore, which, I'm gonna be honest, I've really enjoyed, and we are not nearly done. I really like, especially being able to do it faction by faction, because you just you get like a base idea of the world together, and then as you start to dig into another faction to prep for a video, just like it starts to slot together really well. And for me, that's how today's faction kind of started to round itself out in my brain when I was a little confused on where they fit in at first, and that's 100 Kingdoms.
Yeah.
And
100 Kingdoms are like the normal humans?
Yes. I mean, the literal everyday dudes. Guys with crossbows, peasants with pikes, men in armor with big swords, guys on huge horses running down enemies. It's all...
No. Not a monster in sight. No T-Rex, no giant.
What a shame.
Perfectly normal human dudes.
How sad.
Nothing
for all
Nothing weird at all, I promise.
Yeah. Let's see how long we can keep that going until we get to the orders. I'm sure everything there is totally fine and normal. The 100 Kingdoms are a faction that I think are really interesting to talk about the lore for because they're relatable. They're a great way that if you're just getting into the setting, or maybe you're newer to the game and you're trying to wrap your head around how this whole world works, trying to start at a level of sort of like the 100 Kingdoms is a really great way to do that. Because, let's be honest, we understand the perspective very intimately. It's easy to put yourself in their shoes. Whereas if you were to try to start with something like Spires, or maybe even Wadroon, you might struggle a little bit. I think Dwegum is similar. Like, they're just kind of hard to get in the headspace for. But stuff like 100 Kingdoms or Nords, it's very easy to understand their motivations.
Yeah, and I also think they're of all the factions, they're the most diverse when it comes to motivations, and like they're the most moldable to whatever you want them to be, because there is quite literally 100 kingdoms, so you can just make your kingdom whatever you want it to be of humans, which is a lot different than like some of the others. Like Nords have a very rich, deep lore, but it's like based around Norse mythology that's been twisted and warped to Spires stuff.
It's hard to deviate from that at its core, but your kingdom can be most anything. And I think that kind of speaks to the broad strokes that their lore actually paints in the setting, because it is broad, to say the least. To discuss the 100 Kingdoms, I think in any amount of depth or specificity, you have to start with their history to understand where they came from, which will then add context, as often is the case, to where they are now and how they got there. And when you look at some of the units that look a little off, or maybe they don't look cohesive in the model lines, you'll understand the sort of visual story that they are implying through the difference in designs for the models. And to talk about the 100 Kingdoms today, you have to go back to the Old Dominion. For people out there, you might have recognized them as like the zombie legionnaire sort of models, that sort of faction. It's the same one in this case. But this sort of starts before all of the zombification happened. Before George A. Romero got involved, before Night of the Living Dead, like we are jumping back even further. Back when
they were like still people.
Yes, and even before they were sort of like the high Roman legion that you would expect. Truly, like the start of 100 Kingdoms is back when humans were a little less stationed in one place, more mobile, had less tools to keep yourself warm on like cold, long nights. And that is where some humans found a remnant, something that they did not understand at the time. They couldn't. But we know from like player perspective that it's a remnant of a Dwegum battle. A shard of creation, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, it's not extremely specific, but like from the primordial concept of creation, there's this small shard of energy that is almost like a vessel that can be filled with things, and it's being harnessed by the Dwegum as like a full fuel source and like this outpost. and like these tribal humans fleeing a particularly bad winter find it in one of these outposts, and then like it's giving off radiating heat, so they just start collecting around it and just sort of giving their energy to it in the form of like worshiping it in a way, like in the same way that you sort of put emotion into a fire when you're standing around it. They're doing this, but for generations around this like really warm spot.
Mm-hmm. And as you can imagine, as like this little shard of what is essentially like creation or godhood, like a little seed, as people stay around it for longer and longer, they have more intense thoughts and feelings and interact with each other. This starts to imbue this shard with enough power to become a god, I guess. A god in the setting, not like capital G, but like a god. Hazlia. And again, if you've done any research on Old Dominion lore, yes, that Hazlia. We're getting there. And once that little moat becomes Hazlia, humanity has a golden age. Now they are backed by a true god that has, a form of sentience that has a purpose that has more power to it. And as they spread, as their kingdom grows, more and more worshippers join the worship of Hazlia. It further makes Hazlia stronger, further enhancing the ability of humanity to spread and reproduce and prosper. And that's how they go from being a little tribal society to fairly quickly, in terms of like a societal development, becoming a highly developed, highly expansive civilization. Sort of similar to what you might imagine from like a lot of imaginings of the old Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, a lot of deviations, but the themes are there. And on one hand, this is great. Hazlia's dominion is huge. Humanity gets a whole lot of technology we didn't have access to before then, especially jumping into the Metal Age, which is colossal for industrialization and advancement of a species.
Yeah, like one of the big things is that a lot of the leftover Dweghom stuff on the surface is found by Hazlia and like the people who worship Hazlia, and Hazlia sort of shows them what it is and how it works. Like, how does metallurgy work? How does, like architecture work? And teaches them these things, and they learn these concepts and then build upon them very quickly because they're using essentially another civilization's foundation.
Mm-hmm. And for the Dweghom, like, they're not really super attached to these things because they're just utilitarian tools to like win honor. So it works out. It just works out well for humanity. But that golden age can't last forever, and as all golden ages do, they have to come to an end. And for 100 Kingdoms, that happens largely due to the relationship with the god Hazlia. While it started very strong, they were very close, and Hazlia was prosperous, a couple of things started to happen at once that all started to have enough resonance to cause fissures in that relationship. First and foremost, that as humanity spread further and further, and as they experienced more and more challenges, their lives got harder and harder. They started to pray to their god to help them with more and more challenges that they were running into. And it's one thing to do that in like our thought of a god, but you have to think here, gods are formed by the prayers and beliefs of their worshippers. And if you're getting pulled in one direction to be a god of war, but you're being pulled in another direction to be a god of the hearth, and you're also being pulled in another direction to be a god of the harvest, and you're being pulled in another direction to like ferry the afterlife and to try to tend to that, you're being pulled in another direction for intelligence, you're being pulled in another direction to forge, that would be frustrating for any person, much less for a god whose essence is being pulled in different directions, which creates some issues, as you can imagine. Combined with also that Hazlia is bound to humanity alone, rather than just doing sort of a handful of domains and then having a broad spectrum of worshippers feeding into their creation. They were humanity's god, and only humanity's god.
Yeah, Hazlia sort of looked up to the stars and like the grander universe and goes, "There's so much more out there I could be doing, but I'm stuck here in this small town with these humans."
Yes. Which, like,
Like
on a
Hazlia found pop punk and was just like, "What do I do about this?"
and it's one of those things like, oh, what do you mean? You're like the god of this big empire. But on a cosmic scale, when you have that much power, that's got to chafe. You've got to want to see what's out there. What else you could do. Or at the least spread to other species or races or groups to try to expand your own power base or experience base or worshipper base. But those two things pulling in different directions led to no one being happy with the situation. Obviously, Hazlia couldn't deliver in all of these various directions that they're being pulled in. Also, nor could they just break free of the humans altogether because they only exist because of these humans worshipping them. No one could get what they want. And when no one can get what they want and there's no apparent way out, as often happens, things turn nasty quickly, and in this case, outright violent.
Yeah, so like there's a whole bunch of sorcerers in the Old Dominion. It is like magic land, mega magic land, and so the church at the time and like much of the like wizardy college-y types all sort of like band together and hatch the secret plot of like how to sever Hazlia from humanity. And like that's not just a thing that happens and then everything goes to shit. It is more along the lines of like this is a steady progress forward to that point while also dealing with the infighting that comes with a sort of a civil war. Because there's a bunch of people still devoted to Hazlia. Like there's a lot of people who are not going to sign on for this. But they sort of go forward with it regardless. And somehow they manage to shatter Hazlia's connection to like the Hunter Kingdom, to the Old Dominion, and humanity as a whole. And that triggers something called the Fall. And we'll get into the rest of what happens with those series of events when we talk about Old Dominion. But what we really care about here is the Fall. Because during this huge 300-year calamity that happens over these 3 centuries of just like constant natural disasters and wars and magical cataclysm and undead are coming into the world for the first time. Just like all of these terrible, terrible nightmare things were happening. It's like a 300-year apocalypse. A group called the Last Legion, which are this very powerful, technologically advanced, very talented group of soldiers, leave westward with refugees of these disasters.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where the 100 Kingdoms story really starts, as they travel across like this wasteland to this land that has people in it already. And when I say people, I mean like there are some normal people there. There are the Weavers way to the west. We now know that there were Sorcerer Kings to the west as well. And you know that there are Nords to the north. Mm-hmm. And the Wadrun exist out there. And there's still Dwegum. And there's Spires, right? Like these humans left this terrible nightmare place to this new place to forge their own destiny. It doesn't necessarily go as planned either. Because they didn't have a way of setting up a government. It is a military order that brought them here, and the military order, the Last Legion, goes, we don't know how to run a government.
Not their job. Not their training. Very specifically, never their training. Never in their purview. Oh, and you also have to think, like, when is there time to plan when there are undead mouths at your back, hunger in your stomach, and then terrible aliens from outside of your concept of reality in front of you? Where do you go? Like, in what spare time or safety are you going to start drafting some articles of government? It's just the situation doesn't allow for that sort of thinking. It's too dangerous in every way.
And so, like, the answer ends up becoming a lot of warlords come out of this. A ton of, like, might makes right style leaders. Yeah. Whether they were old nobility from the old time or they were new soldiers who could just grasp power and grab land for their own. And they've each formed these different kingdoms. And they're called the 100 Kingdoms for that, right? They are not one collective country. They are many different kingdoms all vying for power and influence over one another. But what makes them interesting is that they also have to work together because they're all still humans, right? And you're fighting these like genetically changed Nords, you're fighting the Spires, you're fighting Dwegum, you're fighting Weavers, you're fighting all this stuff. What do you do? Like, if you have aliens coming to attack you from these weird Lovecraftian, like, flesh towers in the middle of the valley, you're going to work together. But then as soon as that's over with, you're going to go back to trying to stab each other.
Yeah, there's nothing that quite brings neighbors together like an Avatara construct charging at your front gates while screeching language in like 12 dimensions. It's just, maybe you don't care so much that your neighbor once called you a turd. Like, maybe that's water under the bridge.
Yeah, and like, you would think that that's just like where this story of origins ends, but it doesn't, because a couple other things happen. A church is created over time that sort of like connects all of that together. Like, all of the people of humanity sort of followed these two thoughts of like church religion, right? And that is theists and deists, and we'll explain the difference here in a little bit. But that is really what you need to know, is that people fall into one of those two camps. They're either theists or they're deists, but they all work together with the church. And it's sort of like a unifying thing across all of these kingdoms that makes them work together, is this understanding that they came from the same place, so they should work together at times, but they still can't help but fight with each other.
I mean, the politicking is, it's preeminent, as you can imagine. There are when you have nobles and you have religious figures and all of that is interacting with scholarly types and everyone's pushing for power, resources are limited, land is limited. I mean, you see it within human history that's going to cause friction and infighting and squabbles. And I mean, it's still happening today. And they're no different. But the thing is here is that they're kept under pressure for so long that the Empire never has a chance to sort of assess where they are at politically or spiritually or societally and try to start mending those wounds, not in a very, very deep way, to genuinely come together as one kingdom. And instead, they just really get rooted into this idea that everyone is going to build their borders and we are each going to fight for land with our fellow kingdoms. Political corruption is starting to take in with that. Religious corruption with that. And now the 100 Kingdoms are largely kept as just 100 Kingdoms because they're sort of in a place of societal malaise.
And there are times where they have tried to combine. There was an empire at some point where they kind of put away all their differences and you need it united together, not just in the church, not just in the order, but together into an empire. And that lasted a decent amount of time, but eventually rotted away due to these same issues, right? The corruption, the vying for power, the individualized like nationalities of these kingdoms now, like it caused them to regress back into feuding like kingdoms, even though they had an empire. And that left remnants that we'll also get into of like why, like what came from that. But that's sort of 100 Kingdoms as a whole. Like there's tons of them. There's a couple of named ones like Rismark, and like you can read articles and stuff about them on Parabellum. But really, like what makes the rest of the 100 Kingdoms as a faction in the game interesting are some of the sub-factions. Mm-hmm. And the big one that probably has the most models behind it is the Orders.
Yeah.
And these are descendants of the Last Legion. They're combined with like the immense skill of ability to fight and the best weapons and the best armor and the best horses, with this like ancestral tie to this legion of very, very powerful soldiers from the old kingdom, the old Dominion. And they have this like almost superhuman capability for combat. And they have things like the Order of the Crimson Dawn that are all about fighting the primordial concept of war by minimizing casualties and collateral damage. Or like the Order of the Ashen Dawn, who are these like crazy paladin-esque, powerful, huge men who can fight giants. And like these Order of the Sealed Temple that like are like these somewhat shifty but also quick and just sort of thoughtful, scholarly knights, like very Knights Templary. It's like they're all fascinating, and like there's some that we haven't even seen models for yet, like Order of the Sword, which are these impeccably good sword fighters, like that don't ride horses, they fight with swords and armor on the ground. Like It's awesome. And you'd think that like, oh, so if they're so powerful, why don't they just like take over? Well, because every one of the orders has a different thought process of how things should work and have different things they care about. But the one thing they all seem to agree on is that they collectively should not run all of humanity as a military empire. They all sort of go, that's not the answer. Like ruling with an iron fist, creating a military dictatorship, that's just not going to solve the problem. Because they all do care about one thing above everything else, and that is defending humanity from outside threats. So they will band together with any kingdom to fight Spires, Nords, Droon, Dwegum, any of them. And that's very cool, and it lets them fit into every force.
Yeah, I mean, any kingdom, regardless of petty squabbles or nobles bickering or like priests or theists or deists getting in the way and arguing, if you light the beacons and there's a threat, the order will arrive. Which, as you can imagine, gives them a groundswell of support with the actual general populace.
Yeah, they get a huge amount of support from the common men who all see them as like these fantastical heroes. And like that also allows them to leverage the nobility and the kingdoms in certain ways. The Order of the Crimson Tower, for instance, have a stipulation in order to like take part in combat, like take part in a battle with a kingdom. And that is like they have to have a good enough reason. If there's not a good enough reason, they just won't do it. And then on top of that, there can be no looting or pillaging. Like they make the noble decide and choose that they're not going to make a monetary benefit from this conflict. That they are purely there because the cause is just enough to fight for. Mm-hmm. They're not doing it for money and wealth.
Which, as you can imagine, makes people a little angry because nobles be nobles. And that's the next subfaction of 100 Kingdoms. And it's just the nobility. As you can imagine, the nobility, they take a lot of forms. You could riff on this for your own personal kingdom if you wanted to make your own, to your heart's content. But the key is that all of them are people who, through their family ties, or their own personal ownings, they own land, they own resources, they own mines, they own things that give them a lot of physical wealth and space to be able to have influence in courts and to try to sway other kingdoms. And once you get into groups like that band together for their own personal gain, yeah, you have some problems.
Yeah, and I mean, there's not a whole lot to say about the nobility because they're exactly what you think they're going to be, right?
Yes.
Like they're just like the people who kind of cause problems for the common person, and like they bicker and fight each other, and they're probably the reason why they can't just collectively get together and deal with some of these problems. But one of the things they constantly have to deal with is something called the imperial remnants. And they're separate from the church, and we'll cover the church next, because the imperial remnants sort of tie into the nobility because they're the thing that keeps them in check. They are a group that, like a military group, that survived the end of the empire, not the Dominion, the empire that existed after the 100 Kingdoms were made. When that collapsed, the leftover remnants banded together, took over a section of land, and that section of land also included like the press for coinage and the banks, as well as the higher education and colleges. And being able to hold on to this meant that they still controlled a significant amount of power in the 100 Kingdoms. Not because they were choosing to use this for their own gain, but because they've decided that holding this is what is going to stop any one of the other kingdoms from becoming too powerful. From any one of the other kingdoms taking over everything, is because they are sitting on this, and it's mostly ran by a group called the Steel Legion, which are these impeccable, perfect fighters who like are seen as these like epitome of hero. Like when you think of a paladin, that's Steel Legion.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and that's what they do. They defend the rights of the people. And one of the interesting subsects of this is one of my favorite concepts in it, which is something called the Order of the Silver Shield, which is a group of people who like they are individuals who roam around the 100 Kingdoms, and they find different members of nobility and sees if they're mistreating peasants or like treating their people poorly or not providing like defenses for humanity or not assisting the church or like not doing their part. Essentially, if they are only about personal gain, they can become judge, jury, and executioner and just kill nobility that are not doing what needs to be done. And that's fascinating in like a dark fantasy setting. is having a group of paladins who can just kill nobility because they're being shitty.
Also, like, it is just like a little noble bright, and I like it, but also it is a little dark that the only way for some of them to get together is just to outright murder them. Really, really fun play.
Yeah.
And also, it's a nice way to have a faction that can lean on some of the other kingdoms or nobles through monetary tariffs and taxes because they control the banks. They can shut off the money flow. So play ball. If you don't, it's going to hurt you, and not physically. So get in line. That's cool.
But the other side of that is they don't have many of the resources. So like some of the other kingdoms control power by having like the best iron mine in the area, having the most amount of lumber, having the best horses, like things that are all needed for the war effort, or just like farmland because you got to feed people, right? This all creates these powers because it's resources. And that like this is sort of like a checks and balances internally. But the thing that's kind of not included with those checks and balances is the faith.
Oh, that's totally outside of all of it. Good God, they've sidestepped it all.
Because the church here falls into two camps, the theists and the deists. And we're going to start off with the theists. The theists believe that humanity themselves fell from grace as punishment by the gods for being flawed. That they, like humanity themselves, caused the fall themselves completely for their own natural born sins. And the ones that are left, the ones that survived the fall, were the chosen to rebuild humanity with a true righteous faith behind it. That they alone were chosen to create a new world that learns from the mistakes of the past and creates a better future that does not cause the fall again. And it covers on all the Catholic guilt stuff you're used to, right?
Yeah, I don't find it personally compelling, but I don't think it's obviously meant to fill a hole in the world. I think it fills it really well.
Yes. The one that I find interesting and I found unique was the deists, right? The deists exist as a religion next to the theists. And they believe kind of the opposite, where the theists believe that man was made in God's image and didn't live up to that. They believe the opposite, that the god Hazlia, that they don't call Hazlia, they just call God, that God was created in their image. That God was created by men, and the problem with humanity and why they caused the fall was because humanity themselves lacked the perspective and the understanding to see that those gods were just as flawed as they were. And the only way to heal and recover that, and the only way to try to make the world a place where the fall can't happen again, is if each individual person takes it upon themselves to see where they themselves are flawed and what they are not flawed in, and to heal the things they are flawed in, and to project the things they are not flawed in, and to do that in others, and to share through collective effort how to improve. It's all about personal improvement and accepting responsibility and understanding. Which is way cooler than
I'm into
theists.
that.
But the thing is the theists hold more power because it's a lot easier to have power when you just guilt trip everyone into doing stuff. And the deists instead are just like, hey, just try to be better people to one another.
That's gonna anger a lot of folks.
Yeah.
Historically speaking.
Yeah. Which is fascinating that's the way they chose to show religion in this game. It's very cool. And that's shown in the lore where they are ever increasingly getting to a point where they're going to have a schism and they're going to fight one another, where they just constantly argue with each other. Because really, it all forms on this crux between we cause the fall because we are inherently bad, and we cause the fall because our lack of perception warped this thing that we shove our energy into. And we did that because we refused to seek understanding. Right? Those two things are different enough that it causes these two parts to bash heads against one another, which is such an interesting concept for religion.
And who's going to win is very up in the air. Very up in the air.
To be clear, this is not exactly the core, like, this is what happened in the lore. Like, this is just these people's understanding of it, which I also think is a clever thing for Parabellum, so they can change it as time goes on. Like, the religion itself can evolve, which is awesome. It's very, very cool. And it's just, like, I think that's a nice way to sort of end the 100 Kingdoms, right? Is to talk about how, like, those two ideologies are sort of emboldening within the faction, right? You have the corrupt nobility, the corrupt church, you have the power-hungry, like, cruelty that humans can have, the pettiness, the strive for power, this, like, unending inability to, like, just work together and deal with the problem at hand because you're too busy worried about yourself. And on the other hand, you've got these, like, entire orders and groups and non-stop working towards trying to survive in a place not meant for you, and just fighting ever increasingly terrifying odds for no other reason but to survive. Like, those are two awesome things, and they're in the same faction.
And also, I think it shows a lot of why I think 100 Kingdoms is cool, especially if you're into writing your own fluff or your own city or your own kingdom. You can imagine these things that we just talked about, the idea of the two halves of the faith, the nobility, the orders, the imperial remnants, all of those things pairing together in interesting ways. So, for example, you could imagine a character that could be a deist noble who is truly trying to work against the scheming pettiness of their fellow nobles. Or you could imagine the idea of a theist priest who has absolutely lost their friggin' marbles and is damn near burning people at the stake. You could do the same for the orders and make any of them more antagonistic or protagonistic, I guess, if that's a word, in any way you want. You can mix and match to your heart's content. You could slot any of these into any role you want in your own fluff as being those that are kind of like working for your kingdom or hurdles for your kingdom. And I love that ability for a player to just like really get their hands dirty, and whatever you write for your kingdom will be supported within this structure of the fluff. Like, nothing is off the table here.
Yeah. And they have also shown that there's plenty of room to grow within them. Like the orders, there's more orders coming. There's Order of the St. Lazarus, Order of the Sword. And like, I'm fascinated to see where the rest of this faction goes. I have not been let down by anything I've seen from Parabellum so far when it comes to factions and lore and interesting models. So I'm curious to see what else happens. But the one thing I do know is that the Ashen Dawn can absolutely suplex an ice giant.
By God, I've felt it happen to my own boy. They're very tough. They're supposed to be regular dudes, but them ain't regular dudes. I really want to see, like, there's an underlying bit there of, like, these guys are getting the juice from somewhere. Is that magic? Is that faith? Do they know? Maybe not. Maybe it's both. Maybe it's something else. Who knows? But it's, another little mystery laid down that I'm sure we will get answers to as this all unfolds. And for us, there are really no better places to start if you want to read some more about this fluff outside of what we've done here. There are a couple short stories. John mentioned them quickly, but then we'll put links to them in the show notes down below from the Parabellum website. John, what are your story picks?
So there's a series of 3 short stories who all work together. They're based off of the first box set for Conquest, which is Spires, which is 100 Kingdoms. And they're just 3 short stories. I think each of them's like 15 to 30 pages each. So they're not very long, but I think they give a really good example of what the world is like from a human perspective. I think it's really worth like reading and getting into. I read them myself. Very good. Highly suggest that you read them. I highly suggest just going through Parabellum and reading a bunch of the lore stuff. I know we don't have a ton of lore videos out, but you can go ahead and watch more of our lore videos if you want to. Otherwise, there's places like 2 Plus Tough. He covers a bunch of lore videos.
Excellent.
A lot of stuff that we haven't covered. Highly suggest. We don't have an affiliate link. We've had some people ask about it. He does. go to him and like watch his videos. Use his affiliate link. He's a cool guy. Support him.
It's true. Doug's a delight.
And beyond that, if Conquest is a thing you're interested in, go to Parabellum's website, check it out. If you're in the Cincinnati area, we play at a shop called Tactical Retreat Gaming. It's over near Amelia. Head out there and play. Like, they got Conquest stuff. You can come play games.
They're the only place I know of that can order it anywhere near Cincinnati. Highly recommend it.
I drive 2 hours up to play all the time, so like, come on down and play. It'd be a great time.
Yeah, and we will be doing more of this lore. It just might take a little bit of time because we're trying to do the baseline of a lot of these factions first. But I would love to talk about the orders some more and the idea of the two faiths. Maybe the faiths would be a little harder, but like I would love to break down the orders and the Imperial remnants in a video, and then also try to tackle the faiths in another. And if y'all want some stuff like that, if there are particular things here you want to hear about, very sort of like thin slices of fluff, let us know. We'll work on them. For now, that's been all of our opinions. Bonafide, Kentucky Fried. We'll see y'all in the next video.